The whip cracked across Olivia Prescott's bare shoulders for the third time that scorching afternoon in Humboldt, Nevada, and she bit down so hard on the leather strap between her teeth that she tasted copper. The year was 1878, and the sun beat mercilessly on the wooden platform in the center of town where she stood tied to the post, her wrists bound with rope that cut into her skin. The book that had condemned her lay at the feet of Reverend Thaddeus Crane, its pages fluttering in the hot desert wind. Paradise Lost, a forbidden text in this God-forsaken settlement where the church council determined what thoughts were permissible and what ideas would damn a soul to hellfire. She had known the risk. Every woman in Humboldt knew that reading anything beyond scripture and approved domestic manuals was grounds for public punishment. But Olivia had never been good at following rules that made no sense, especially when her mind hungered for knowledge the way other people craved water in the desert. The traveling merchant who had sold her the Milton volume had warned her to keep it hidden, but someone had seen the candlelight in her window late at night, had peered through the gap in her curtains and witnessed her bent over those precious pages, her lips moving as she absorbed every word about rebellion and paradise, and the complexity of right and wrong. The fourth lash came down and Olivia's knees buckled. Blood ran warm down her back, soaking into the torn fabric of her dress. Through the ringing in her ears, she could hear Reverend Crane's voice droning on about the corruption of the female mind and the dangers of intellectual pride. The crowd that had gathered to watch her punishment stood silent, most of them looking at their feet rather than at her suffering. Sarah Mitchell, the seamstress, had tears running down her cheeks. Even hard old Tom Webster at the mercantile looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. No one dared. Then she heard bootsteps on the wooden platform, firm and purposeful, and a voice she had heard before but never really paid attention to cut through the reverend's sermon like a knife through butter. "That is enough." Olivia forced her eyes open and saw him through the haze of pain. Dalton Burke, the cowboy who worked the cattle ranch 5 miles outside of town. He was tall and weather-beaten, probably around 26 years old, with dark hair that brushed his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. She was 23 herself, old enough to be considered a spinster in this town where most girls married at 16. But she had refused every suitor who came calling because none of them could see her as anything more than a womb and a pair of hands to cook and clean. "Step aside, Mr. Burke," Reverend Crane said coldly. "This woman's punishment has been decreed by the council." "I said that is enough." Dalton's hand rested on the gun at his hip, and though he did not draw it, the threat was clear. "You have made your point, any more and you will kill her." The man holding the whip, Deputy Silas Kern, hesitated and looked to the Reverend for guidance. The crowd had come alive now, murmuring and shifting. Olivia saw calculation flash across Reverend Crane's face. Dalton Burke was not a man to cross lightly. He was quick with a gun and quicker with his fists, and more importantly, he worked for Samuel Garrett, who owned the largest ranch in 3 counties. The church council had power, but money and beef fed this town. "Very well," Reverend Crane said at last, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "Let it not be said that we are without mercy. Cut her down." Deputy Kern moved to untie the ropes at Olivia's wrists, and the moment they fell away, her legs gave out completely. She would have collapsed face first onto the platform if Dalton had not caught her, his strong arms coming around her with surprising gentleness, considering how roughly he handled cattle and horses. The contact of his hands against her shredded back made her gasp in agony, but she swallowed the cry because she would not give these people the satisfaction. "I have got you," Dalton murmured, so quietly that only she could hear. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though in truth she was not sure. Her entire back felt like it was on fire, and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. But she would walk out of here on her own 2 feet or die trying. He seemed to understand because he kept his arm around her waist, supporting her weight without making it obvious how much she was leaning on him, allowing her to keep her dignity as they descended the steps of the platform. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. Olivia kept her chin up and her eyes forward, refusing to show shame for something that should never have been a crime. Her small house was at the far end of the main street, a tiny structure she rented from the widow Henderson, barely more than a room and a half, but it was hers, and it had a door she could close against the judgment of the world. Dalton helped her up the 2 steps to her porch, and she fumbled with shaking hands for the key in her pocket. He took it from her gently and unlocked the door, then guided her inside. The interior was dim and blessedly cool compared to the brutal heat outside. She had very few possessions. A narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, a trunk that held her spare dress and underthings, a shelf with a tin cup and plate and the pot she used for cooking, and hidden beneath a loose floorboard under the bed, 3 more forbidden books she had collected over the past 2 years. "You need to lie down on your stomach," Dalton said, closing the door behind them. "Those wounds need tending or they will fester." "I can manage," Olivia said through gritted teeth, though they both knew she could not reach her own back. Pride was a bitter thing to swallow, but infection would kill her just as surely as any whip. "I am sure you could manage anything you set your mind to," Dalton said, and there was something in his tone that made her look at him sharply. Not mockery, not the condescension she was used to from men. "Respect, maybe, but you do not have to. Let me help." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for ulterior motives, for the trap she had learned to expect. But all she saw was honest concern and something else she could not quite name. Finally, she nodded and moved carefully to the bed, lowering herself onto her stomach with movements that sent fresh waves of agony radiating through her body. Dalton looked around the sparse room, assessing what resources were available. "Do you have clean water, cloth for bandages?" "There is a pitcher and basin on the table," Olivia said, her voice muffled against the thin pillow. "Clean rags in the trunk." She heard him moving around, the splash of water being poured, the creak of the trunk opening. Then his footsteps approached the bed, and the mattress dipped slightly as he sat beside her. His fingers were careful as they peeled away what remained of her dress, exposing the full damage of the flogging. She felt rather than heard his sharp intake of breath. "Those sons of bitches," he muttered, and the raw anger in his voice surprised her. "This is barbaric. This is Humboldt," Olivia said flatly. "This is what passes for justice when men decide that knowledge is dangerous." The wet cloth touched her torn skin, and she could not quite suppress her gasp of pain. Dalton froze immediately. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I will be as gentle as I can, but this needs to be cleaned." "I know." She squeezed her eyes shut and forced herself to breathe slowly through her nose as he worked. His hands were surprisingly tender for a man who spent his days wrestling steers and breaking horses. He cleaned each wound with careful attention, washing away the blood and dirt, and she found herself focusing on the steadiness of his presence rather than the pain. "Why did you do it?" he asked after several minutes of silence. "Why risk this for a book?" Olivia was quiet for a moment, considering whether to answer honestly. What did it matter now? Everyone knew what she was. "Because I refuse to live in a cage," she finally said. "Even if the bars are made of ignorance instead of iron. Those books are windows to worlds beyond this dust and heat and suffocating control. They are proof that people have thought great thoughts and asked difficult questions and created beauty out of words. Why should that be forbidden? Why should wanting to learn make me a criminal? She felt his hand still against her back. You are right, he said softly. It should not. Something in the way he said it made her turn her head to look at him over her shoulder, despite the pain the movement caused. You can read. It was not a question. She saw the truth in his eyes before he nodded slowly. My mother taught me before she died. She believed education was the birthright of every person, regardless of station or gender. She had been a school teacher back east before my father brought her out here. She made sure I knew my letters and my numbers, and she read to me every night. Shakespeare, Dickens, Homer. She said a mind without books was like a bird without wings. Your mother was a wise woman, Olivia said, and felt tears prick her eyes for a woman she had never met. For the mother she herself had lost to fever when she was only 10 years old, before there had been time for such gifts to be passed down. She would have liked you, Dalton said, and there was such warmth in his voice that Olivia felt something crack open in her chest, some frozen place that had learned not to hope for understanding. He returned his attention to her wounds, applying what looked like a salve he had pulled from his own pocket. This will help with infection. I use it on the horses when they get cut up in the brush. How flattering, Olivia said dryly, and was rewarded with a soft huff of laughter. The horses heal clean with this, he said. That is the highest compliment I can give. He worked in silence for a while longer, spreading the salve across every laceration with infinite patience, then carefully binding her back with the clean cloth strips. When he was finished, he helped her sit up slowly, keeping a steadying hand on her arm. She felt dizzy and slightly sick, but the worst of the pain had dulled to a throbbing ache. Thank you, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. You did not have to help me. Yes, I did, Dalton said simply. He stood and moved to the basin to wash his hands, and she watched the strong lines of his back, the capable way he moved, and wondered what it would be like to trust someone the way she was beginning to trust him. Will you be all right here alone? Do you have anyone who can check on you? Olivia almost laughed. I have been alone since my mother died 13 years ago. I have learned to check on myself. The look he gave her was equal parts admiration and sadness. No one should have to be that alone. Before she could formulate a response to that, he picked up his hat from where he had set it on the table and moved toward the door. But he paused with his hand on the latch and looked back at her. Miss Prescott, I will be back tomorrow to change those bandages. And I will bring you something I think you might appreciate. You do not have to, she started, but he shook his head. I know I do not have to. I want to. He settled his hat on his head and opened the door, letting in a slice of golden late afternoon light. Get some rest. Try to eat something if you can. Then he was gone, and Olivia was left alone in the dimness of her little house, her back on fire and her mind spinning with questions. Why had Dalton Burke, a man she had barely spoken to in the year since he had arrived in Humboldt, stepped in to stop her punishment? Why did he look at her like she was a person rather than a problem? And what was he planning to bring her tomorrow? She did not have answers, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself looking forward to the next day. Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by pain every time she shifted position. She finally gave up as dawn light began to creep through her single window and eased herself carefully out of bed. Moving was agony, but staying still was worse. She managed to heat water on her small stove and make weak coffee, and was sitting at her table sipping it slowly when she heard a knock at her door. Her whole body tensed. Was it Reverend Crane, come to deliver more judgment? Deputy Kern with some new decree from the church council? But when she opened the door a crack, she found Dalton standing on her porch, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder and concern in his gray eyes. May I come in? He asked. She stepped back and let him enter, suddenly conscious of how she must look with her hair unbrushed and yesterday's torn dress still hanging on her frame because she could not manage to lift her arms high enough to change clothes. But if Dalton noticed or cared, he gave no sign. He set his satchel on the table and turned to her with professional assessment. "How did you sleep?" "I have had better nights," Olivia admitted, "but I am still here, which is more than some expected, I am sure. You are stronger than they know." He pulled supplies from his satchel, fresh bandages and more of that horse salve, and some kind of powder wrapped in paper. "I brought willow bark. If you mix it with hot water and drink it, it will help with the pain and fever." "You are quite the healer for a cowboy," she observed as he prepared the mixture for her, his hands sure and steady. "I have had to be. The ranch is a long way from the doctor in town, and even if it was not, Doc Williams drinks more than he practices medicine these days." He handed her the cup of bitter-smelling tea. "Drink all of it." She obeyed, grimacing at the taste but grateful for anything that might dull the constant throbbing. While she drank, Dalton moved behind her and began carefully unwrapping yesterday's bandages. She could tell by his silence that he was checking for signs of infection, and when he finally spoke, there was relief in his voice. "It looks clean. You are healing well." He applied fresh salve and new bandages, with the same gentle competence he had shown the day before, and Olivia found herself relaxing into his care, despite a lifetime of learning not to depend on anyone. When he was finished, he came back around to face her and reached into his satchel one more time. What he pulled out made Olivia's breath catch in her throat. Books. 4 of them, leather-bound and clearly well-loved, with pages that showed the softness of frequent reading. "I do not have many," Dalton said, setting them on her table with reverent care. "And they are not fancy editions, but they are yours if you want them. Moby Dick, Wuthering Heights, The Count of Monte Cristo, and a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman." Olivia stared at the books like they were made of gold and starlight. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the nearest one, the Whitman. She opened it carefully and saw handwritten inscriptions on the inside cover. "To Dalton, may you always find yourself in verses. With love, Mother." The date was 1869, 9 years ago. "These were your mother's," she whispered, looking up at him with wide eyes. "I cannot take these." "She would have wanted someone to read them," Dalton said firmly. "They have been sitting in my saddlebag for years because I do not have anywhere safe to keep them at the ranch. The bunkhouse is no place for books, but you would treasure them. You would give them the life they deserve." "They will find them," Olivia said, fear threading through her voice. "The church council, they will search my house now. They will be watching for any excuse to finish what they started." "Then I will keep them for you," Dalton said without hesitation. "I will bring you one at a time, and when you finish it, we will trade. That way you will always have something to read, but they will never find evidence of more." The practicality of it, the simple solution to an impossible problem, made something warm bloom in Olivia's chest. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You barely know me." "You could get in trouble yourself for helping me." Dalton was quiet for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes searching her face. "Because when I saw you on that platform yesterday, bleeding and defiant, refusing to apologize for wanting to learn, I saw everything that is wrong with this town, with this whole territory. We came west for freedom, or so they told us, but all we did was bring the same chains of ignorance and fear and control. You were willing to suffer for your right to read, to think, to be more than what they tell you to be. That kind of courage deserves to be honored, not punished." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, became more vulnerable. "And if I am being completely honest, I have noticed you for months now. The way you walk through town with your head high, even when people whisper about you being unmarried and unnatural. The way you help Widow Henderson with her garden without being asked, and bring soup to the Johansson family when their youngest was sick, even though they are among your harshest critics. You are good, Olivia Prescott. You are kind and you are brave and you deserve better than what this town has given you. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. No one had ever seen her, really seen her, the way Dalton seemed to. Olivia felt tears spill down her cheeks before she could stop them, and she quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand. "I am sorry," she said, frustrated with herself for showing such weakness. "Do not be." Dalton's voice was gentle. "You have earned the right to cry. You have earned the right to feel everything you feel." They stayed like that for a moment, looking at each other across her tiny kitchen, and Olivia felt something pass between them, some understanding that went deeper than words. Then Dalton cleared his throat and stepped back, giving her space. "I should go," he said, "but I will be back tomorrow and the next day, every day until you are healed." "The ranch," Olivia protested. "Your work." "I start before dawn and finish after dark. I can spare an hour in between." He moved toward the door, then turned back with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Besides, Mr. Garrett is a reasonable man. When I told him what happened and that I was going to make sure you recovered properly, he gave me his blessing. He has no love for the church council's methods." After he left, Olivia sat at her table for a long time, staring at the 4 books he had left with her, running her fingers over their spines. She chose the Whitman and opened it carefully, mindful of her still healing back, and began to read. The words washed over her like cool water in the desert, and for a little while she forgot about pain and fear and the uncertain future. There was only the poetry, and the memory of kind gray eyes, and the beginning of something that felt dangerously close to hope. True to his word, Dalton came every day. He would arrive in the late morning after his first round of work at the ranch was done, and he would tend to her wounds with careful hands. Then he would stay and talk with her, or sometimes they would sit in companionable silence while she read aloud from whatever book she was currently devouring. She discovered that he had a dry wit that surprised laughs out of her when she least expected it, and a thoughtfulness that showed in the way he really listened when she spoke, not just waiting for his turn to talk. By the end of the first week, her wounds had progressed from open lacerations to angry scabs. By the end of the second week, she could move without wincing every time. And somewhere in those 2 weeks, she realized she had started to fall in love with Dalton Burke. It was not a dramatic revelation, no lightning bolt moment. It was in the small things. The way he remembered that she preferred her coffee black and strong. The way he brought her wildflowers he had found on his ride into town, claiming they had reminded him of her because they thrived in harsh conditions. The way he looked at her when she was reading, like she was something precious and rare. The way his hand would linger on hers when he passed her the cup of willow bark tea, his calloused fingers rough but warm. She did not know if he felt the same way. She told herself it did not matter, that his friendship was already more than she had any right to hope for. But sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, and her heart would beat a little faster. It was exactly 16 days after the flogging when Dalton arrived at her door looking troubled. Olivia had been well enough to return to her work doing laundry for the hotel, and she was hanging sheets on the line in her small backyard when she heard his knock. She hurried around to the front, wiping her damp hands on her apron. "What is wrong?" she asked immediately because she had learned to read his moods. "We need to talk," he said, and her stomach dropped. Those words were never followed by anything good. He came inside and she closed the door, suddenly very aware of how small her house was, how close they were standing. "The church council held a meeting last night," Dalton said without preamble. "They have decided that you are a corrupting influence on the town. They want you gone." Olivia felt the blood drain from her face. "They are exiling me. They are giving you 1 week to leave Humboldt. If you are still here after that, they will arrest you on charges of moral corruption, and you will go to prison." Dalton's jaw was tight with anger. "It is tyranny dressed up as righteousness. Where am I supposed to go?" Olivia heard the panic in her own voice and hated it, but this was her home, such as it was. She had nowhere else. No family, no resources, barely enough money saved to survive a month on her own. "You could come to the Garrett Ranch," Dalton said, and the words tumbled out like he had been holding them back for days. "Mr. Garrett needs someone to manage the household. His wife died 3 years ago and the place has been falling apart without a woman's touch. It would be honest work, decent pay, and you would be beyond the reach of the church council. The ranch is not technically part of Humboldt Township, so their jurisdiction does not extend there." It was a lifeline, and Olivia wanted to grab it with both hands. But she forced herself to think clearly. Would I be safe there, or would the council find some excuse to come after me anyway? "Mr. Garrett does not bow to the council," Dalton said firmly. "He is the law on his land and he has men who will enforce that. If he offers you his protection, you will be protected." He paused, and something vulnerable flickered across his face. "And I would be there. I would not let anyone hurt you again." The weight of that promise settled around Olivia's shoulders like a cloak. She looked at this man who had appeared in her life, like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to form, who had shown her kindness when the world offered only cruelty, who had risked his standing in the community to defend her right to read and think and be herself. And she knew that if she went to the Garrett Ranch, it would not just be for the work or the safety. It would be for him. "When would I start?" she asked quietly. The relief that washed over Dalton's face was almost painful to witness. "I will talk to Mr. Garrett today. If he agrees, and I am certain he will, you could move to the ranch by the end of the week." "Then yes," Olivia said, and felt like she was stepping off a cliff into empty air, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "Yes, I will come." Dalton's hand came up as if to touch her face, then seemed to think better of it and fell back to his side. "You will not regret this, Olivia. I promise you that." Samuel Garrett turned out to be a man in his late 50s with silver-streaked hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He came to Humboldt himself 3 days later to meet Olivia, bringing a wagon and a driver to transport her belongings. The church council must have gotten wind of what was happening, because Reverend Crane appeared on the main street as they were loading the few things she owned into the wagon bed. "Mr. Garrett," the Reverend called out in his most unctuous tone, "surely you do not wish to shelter a woman of such loose morals under your roof. Think of your reputation." Samuel Garrett turned to face the Reverend with the expression of a man who had dealt with smaller dogs yapping at his heels for decades. "Reverend Crane, my reputation was built on hard work, fair dealing, and knowing quality when I see it. Miss Prescott's only crime was wanting to read books, which, as far as I can tell, makes her smarter than most of the people in this town. My home will be improved by her presence, which is more than I can say for what your preaching has done for Humboldt." The Reverend's face turned an alarming shade of purple, but before he could sputter out a response, Samuel had already turned away and was helping Olivia up onto the wagon seat. Dalton swung up onto his horse beside them, and they rode out of town with the sun climbing toward noon and Olivia feeling like she was being born into a new life. The Garrett Ranch was everything Humboldt was not. where the town was cramped and dusty and mean-spirited. The ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of high desert grassland, with the Ruby Mountains rising purple and majestic in the distance. The main house was a solid two-story structure built of timber and stone, large enough to comfortably hold a family of 10. The bunkhouse for the ranch hands stood a respectful distance away, along with the barns and corrals and all the infrastructure of a working cattle operation. Samuel showed Olivia to her room on the second floor, a space larger than her entire house in town had been, with a real bed frame and mattress, a wardrobe, a writing desk, and a window that looked out over the rolling grasslands. There were even curtains, faded but clean, and a rag rug on the wooden floor. "My wife decorated this room," Samuel said, a touch of old grief in his voice. "She always hoped we would have daughters to fill these spaces. That did not happen, but I think she would be glad to know someone is using it now. You make yourself at home, Miss Prescott. What is mine is yours for as long as you choose to stay." Olivia had to blink back tears at the simple generosity of it. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. You have no idea what this means to me." "I think I do," Samuel said gently. My wife, she was a reader too, had hundreds of books, and she fought with the church council constantly about what was appropriate for women to know. She would have liked you. Would have been spitting mad about what they did to you in town." He left her to settle in, and Olivia spent the rest of the afternoon exploring her new home in a daze. The house needed work, that was certain. Dust coated every surface, the kitchen was disorganized to the point of chaos, and she found evidence of mice in the pantry. But these were problems she could solve, tasks she could sink her hands into. For the first time in years, she felt useful in a way that went beyond simple survival. That evening, Samuel invited her to join him and Dalton for dinner. The meal was simple, beef and beans and bread that was slightly stale, but there was enough of it and the company was better than any food. Samuel told stories about the early days of the ranch, back in the 1860s when Nevada was still wild and lawless, and every day was a gamble. Dalton added his own observations, and Olivia found herself laughing more in one meal than she had in the entire previous year. After dinner, Samuel excused himself to go over the ranch accounts, and Olivia began clearing the dishes. She was elbow-deep in wash water when Dalton appeared at her side with a dish towel. "You do not have to help," she protested. "You have been working all day." "So have you," he pointed out, taking a wet plate from her hands and drying it with efficient movements. "Besides, I like this. It feels normal, peaceful." They worked in silence for a few minutes, falling into an easy rhythm. Then Dalton said, "Are you happy here, truly?" Olivia looked at him, at the way the lamplight caught in his dark hair, at the concern in his gray eyes, at the strong, capable hands that had gentled horses and tended her wounds and offered her books when the world tried to take them away. "Yes," she said softly. "I think I am. Good." His voice was rough with some emotion she did not quite dare name. "You deserve to be happy, Olivia." She wanted to tell him that happiness had always seemed like something for other people, something she had learned not to reach for because the disappointment hurt too much. But he was standing so close, and the kitchen was warm and golden in the lamplight, and the words that came out instead were, "You make me happy." Dalton went very still. The plate in his hands hung suspended in the dish towel, forgotten. "Olivia," he said, and her name sounded like a prayer in his mouth. "I am sorry," she said quickly, turning back to the wash basin to hide the heat in her cheeks. "That was too forward. I should not have said anything." "No." His hand came up to gently turn her face back toward him, his fingers careful against her jaw. "Do not apologize for honesty, not to me, not ever." Her heart was beating so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. Dalton, I do not know what I am doing. I have never felt like this before. Neither have I, he admitted, and the vulnerability in his voice made her brave. I have known plenty of women, Olivia, but none of them made me feel like the world was brighter just because they were in it. None of them made me want to be better than I am. You do. You have, from the moment I saw you standing on that platform refusing to break. You saved me that day, Olivia whispered. You saved yourself, Dalton corrected. I just made sure you survived long enough to do it. You are the strongest person I have ever met, Olivia Prescott. And if you will let me, I would very much like to court you properly, with flowers and walks and all the things you deserve. Joy burst through Olivia like sunrise after a long dark night. I would like that, she said, and then because words did not seem like enough, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft and tentative, a question more than a demand. But Dalton answered it by wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her close, deepening the kiss until she felt like she was drowning in the best possible way. He tasted like coffee and hope, and when they finally broke apart, both breathless, she saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. I have wanted to do that for weeks, Dalton confessed, his forehead resting against hers. Then why did you wait? Because you needed time to heal. Because I wanted you to know me as more than the man who stopped your punishment. Because you deserve to make a choice when you were not vulnerable and in pain. He pulled back enough to meet her gaze directly. I want you to choose me because you want me, Olivia, not because you feel obligated. I want you, she said firmly, leaving no room for doubt. I choose you, Dalton Burke. I choose you every day. The smile that broke across his face was like watching the sun come out from behind clouds. He kissed her again, slower this time, sweeter, and Olivia felt like she was finally coming home to a place she had been searching for her entire life. The months that followed were the happiest of Olivia's life. She threw herself into managing the Garrett household, bringing order to chaos and making the big house feel like a home again. Samuel was delighted with the transformation, and he showed his appreciation by opening his late wife's personal library to Olivia. She found treasures there she had never dreamed of reading, philosophy and science and novels from around the world. She would sit up late into the night devouring books, and often she would look up to find Dalton had come in from the bunkhouse to sit with her, reading his own volume or simply watching her with contentment on his face. They courted in the traditional way, with chaperoned picnics and walks around the ranch property, but there was nothing traditional about the way they talked to each other. Olivia found in Dalton a partner who could match her intellectually, who was not threatened by her intelligence but delighted by it. They would argue philosophy and debate the merits of different authors, and sometimes their discussions would grow so heated that Samuel would laugh and tell them to take it outside before they wore out the floorboards with their pacing. But there were also moments of perfect quiet, when words were not necessary. Times when Dalton would come in from a hard day of work, and she would simply hand him coffee, and he would smile at her like she had given him the world. Times when she would be kneading bread, and he would come up behind her to press a kiss to her neck, and she would lean back into his strength and feel safe in a way she never had before. 6 months after Olivia had arrived at the ranch, Dalton asked her to marry him. They were sitting on the porch of the main house watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, and he pulled a simple silver band from his pocket and held it out to her with hands that were not quite steady. "This was my mother's wedding ring," he said. "It is not fancy, but it is real and it is honest, like I hope I have been with you. Olivia Prescott, you are my best friend and my favorite person, and the woman I want to wake up next to for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" Olivia could barely see the ring through her tears. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. Then he kissed her, deep and thorough, and she thought that this, right here, was what happy endings were made of. They were married in the spring of 1879, a year after the flogging that had brought them together. Samuel offered to host the wedding at the ranch, and they filled the house and yard with everyone who had shown Olivia kindness over the years. Sarah Mitchell, the seamstress, was there, crying happy tears and dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The Johansson family came, looking shamefaced but genuine in their congratulations. Even old Tom Webster from the Mercantile showed up with a wedding gift, a set of fine china that must have cost him dearly. Reverend Crane and the church council were pointedly not invited, and the ceremony was performed by a circuit judge who was a friend of Samuel's. Olivia wore a dress that Sarah had sewn for her, simple white cotton with lace at the collar, and Dalton wore his best suit and looked at her like she was every star in the sky condensed into human form. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Dalton kissed her in front of everyone, and the assembled guests cheered and clapped. Samuel toasted them with whiskey and declared it the best day the ranch had seen since his own wedding 30 years prior. And Olivia, standing in the circle of her new husband's arms, surrounded by people who genuinely cared for her, felt like she had finally found the place she belonged. Samuel offered them one of the smaller houses on the ranch property as a wedding gift, a cozy 3-room structure that Dalton had helped build years before. They spent their first weeks of marriage making it their own, hanging curtains and arranging furniture and christening every room with laughter and love. Olivia set up a small bookshelf in the main room and filled it with volumes from Samuel's library, books she could now read openly without fear. Sometimes she would stand and look at that shelf and feel overwhelmed with gratitude for how much her life had changed. Dalton was a passionate and attentive husband. He worked hard during the day but always came home to her in the evenings, and they would make dinner together and talk about their days and read side by side in the comfortable silence of two people who fit together like puzzle pieces. At night, he would hold her close and whisper words of love against her skin, and she would trace the scars on his hands from years of ranch work and feel like the luckiest woman alive. She still had nightmares sometimes about the flogging, would wake in the dark with phantom pain burning across her back. But Dalton was always there, pulling her into his arms and murmuring reassurances until the fear receded. He never made her feel weak for the lingering trauma, never suggested she should simply get over it. He understood that some wounds took longer to heal, and he was patient with her in a way that made her love him even more fiercely. In the fall of 1879, Olivia discovered she was pregnant. She told Dalton over breakfast one morning, watching nervously for his reaction, and the joy that lit his face was so pure it made her cry. He swept her up into his arms, careful not to squeeze too tight, and spun her around their little kitchen while laughing like a boy. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Olivia, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Dalton said, cupping her face in his hands and kissing her thoroughly. "You have given me everything, Olivia. A home, a purpose, a reason to be better than I thought I could be, and now a child. I do not have words for what I feel." The pregnancy was not easy. Olivia was sick for the first 3 months, could barely keep food down, and she lost weight she could not afford to lose. Dalton fretted over her like a mother hen, bringing her weak tea and dry toast and sitting with her through the worst of it. Samuel hired a woman from a neighboring ranch who had experience with midwifery to check on Olivia regularly, and slowly she began to recover her strength. As her belly grew round with their child, Dalton would spend hours talking to the baby, telling stories about the ranch, and making promises about all the things they would do together. He built a cradle from scratch, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk, and Olivia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Their son was born in May of 1880, a long, difficult labor that left Olivia exhausted but triumphant. Dalton had refused to leave her side despite the midwife's protests that it was not proper, and he had held her hand through every contraction, his strength anchoring her when she thought she could not go on. When the baby finally emerged, red-faced and wailing, Dalton cut the cord with shaking hands and then broke down in tears of joy. They named him James Samuel Burke, after Dalton's father and the man who had given them both a home. Little James had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn chin, and from the moment Olivia held him against her chest, she knew she would do anything to protect this small, perfect person. Dalton was a devoted father, involved in every aspect of James's care in a way that scandalized the few traditional women who still visited from Humboldt. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with the baby when he cried at night, and sang lullabies in a surprisingly sweet tenor voice. Olivia would watch him with their son and fall in love with him all over again. This good man who had saved her and chosen her, and now helped her build a family. As James grew from infant to toddler, the little house rang with laughter and noise. He was a curious child, always getting into things, and Dalton had to child-proof their home to prevent disasters. But even when James dumped flour all over the kitchen floor or tried to feed the chickens Olivia's best embroidery thread, neither parent could stay angry. He was the light of their lives, proof that something beautiful could grow from the dark soil of suffering. When James was 2 years old, Olivia became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do, and she felt strong and capable throughout. Their daughter arrived in the winter of 1883, a smaller, quieter baby than James had been, with fine blonde hair and her father's storm-gray eyes. They named her Martha, after Samuel's late wife and Dalton's mother, and the old rancher cried when they told him. He doted on both children shamelessly, teaching James to ride almost before the boy could walk and reading to baby Martha from the same books his wife had loved. Life settled into a rhythm that felt like home. Olivia still managed the big house for Samuel, though she did less of the physical work now that there were children to care for. She hired women from nearby ranches to help with the cleaning and cooking, providing employment to those who needed it, and creating a small community of workers who all looked out for each other. She also started teaching reading lessons twice a week to anyone on the ranch who wanted to learn. Several of the cowboys, tough men who would never admit to weakness, showed up shyly asking if she could help them with their letters. She taught them with patience and kindness, never making them feel stupid for not knowing, and gradually the ranch became known as a place where learning was valued rather than punished. Dalton eventually became Samuel's foreman, taking on more responsibility as the old rancher's health began to fail. He was good at it, respected by the men and trusted by Samuel to make difficult decisions. The ranch prospered under their joint management, and Olivia felt proud of what they had built together. In the spring of 1885, Samuel Garrett passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 62. He left the ranch in its entirety to Dalton and Olivia, along with a letter expressing his gratitude for the joy and life they had brought back to a place that had felt dead since his wife's passing. At his funeral, Olivia read from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, the same copy that had been one of the first books Dalton had given her, and there was not a dry eye in the assembled crowd. Taking over full ownership of the ranch was daunting, but Olivia and Dalton faced it together as they faced everything. They worked dawn to dusk, making decisions, solving problems, building something that would last for their children and grandchildren. The ranch continued to thrive, and they expanded into horse breeding as well as cattle, with Dalton's skill with horses making them sought after throughout Nevada and beyond. Through it all, they never lost sight of what had brought them together. Olivia still read voraciously, and she made sure their children grew up surrounded by books and ideas and the freedom to question everything. James became an avid reader like his mother, often found with his nose in a book when he should have been doing chores. Martha was more practical, but she had a quick mind and a sharper wit, and she loved nothing more than debating her father at the dinner table. The church council in Humboldt eventually dissolved after Reverend Crane was caught embezzling from the collection plate and fled town in disgrace. A new, more moderate minister took over, and slowly the harsh restrictions on reading and education were lifted. Some of the people who had stood silent while Olivia was flogged came to the ranch years later to apologize, and she accepted their apologies with grace, though she never quite forgot. In the summer of 1890, 12 years after the flogging that had changed everything, Olivia and Dalton took their children on a trip to San Francisco. It was the farthest Olivia had ever traveled, and the city amazed her with its bustle and culture and libraries that held more books than she could read in 10 lifetimes. They visited bookstores and museums, and Dalton bought her a first edition of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets from the Portuguese that made her cry with joy. On their last night in the city, after the children were asleep in the hotel room, Dalton and Olivia stood on the balcony looking out at the lights and the distant dark of the Pacific Ocean. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "You ever regret it?" Dalton asked quietly. "The pain you went through, the life you lost in Humboldt?" Olivia thought about the question seriously, turning it over in her mind. The scars on her back had faded to thin white lines, barely visible now, but she carried them still. Some nights they ached when the weather changed, a reminder of that terrible afternoon. But she also thought about everything that had come after, the books and the love and the home and the children, the life she had built with this good man who had seen her suffering and refused to look away. "No," she said finally, with absolute certainty. "I do not regret any of it. Because it led me to you, to this, to us." Dalton pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, Olivia Burke, more than words can say." "I love you too," she whispered back. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. Thank you for bringing me books and bandaging my wounds and giving me a reason to believe in happy endings." "You gave me all of that too," Dalton said. "You gave me everything." They stood together in the soft California night, two people who had found each other in the harsh landscape of the Old West, who had built something beautiful out of pain and courage and stubborn hope. Behind them, their children slept safe and loved. Around them, a world of possibilities waited to be explored. And between them, a love story that had started with forbidden books and gentle hands and had grown into something that would last all their days. Years later, when James and Martha were grown with children of their own, when the ranch had passed into the hands of the next generation, Olivia and Dalton would sit together on their porch in the evenings. She would read to him from the books that had saved her life, and he would hold her hand and listen to her voice, and they would remember everything they had survived and built together. On Olivia's 50th birthday in 1905, Dalton gave her a journal bound in fine leather. Inside the front cover he had written, "For all the stories you have lived and all the ones you have yet to tell, you are the greatest story I have ever known." She filled that journal with the tale of their life together, every detail she could remember, so that their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would know that love could bloom even in the hardest soil. That courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the person who saves you is really just helping you save yourself. The last entry in the journal, written when she was 78 years old and Dalton was 81, both of them silver-haired and soft around the edges but still sharp in mind and deep in love, read simply, "We built something beautiful. We loved hard and lived true. And we never stopped reaching for the books that set us free." They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch when their time finally came, under a spreading oak tree that Dalton had planted the year they were married. Their graves were marked with simple stones that bore their names and dates and a single line that James had chosen. They read, "They loved, they lived." And in the ranch house that still stood strong, in the library that had grown to fill an entire room, their descendants continued to add books to the shelves and read by lamplight and tell the story of how their family began with a woman brave enough to want knowledge, a man kind enough to help her heal, and a love that proved stronger than all the forces that tried to break them. The forbidden books that had once been contraband were now treasured heirlooms, passed down through generations along with the story of what they had cost and what they had created. And every child born into the Burke family learned early that knowledge was worth fighting for, that love was worth suffering for, and that sometimes the greatest acts of courage looked like a cowboy cleaning wounds and bringing books to a woman who refused to stop reading.